Fallout 76 was released in November 2018. Now if you play games or follow the games industry in any way whatsoever, then you probably know what people thought about the game. To those of you that don't, Fallout 76 received absolutely terrible reviews from everyone across the board. The game was a broken, buggy mess that was almost unplayable. Most people hated it. Hell, even I disliked it the first time I played it. But here's the thing, I ended up enjoying Fallout 76. But I can't recommend it to anyone at all. Not yet, anyway. What this video is going to be is a comprehensive look at the gameplay and story of Fallout 76 through the eyes of a player that has played every single mainline Fallout game, from the original isometric games from Interplay to Bethesda's Fallout 76. I'm also going to be covering how I feel about the inclusion of NPCs now that Wastelanders is released. So, here we go.
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River.
Fallout 76 was meant to be the multiplayer version of Fallout 4, but at some point during development they decided to release it as a full Fallout game. To those of you that have never played a Fallout game, they're basically a post-apocalyptic RPG that takes place after a nuclear war, in a futuristic world that's also stuck in the 1950s. The original games, and Fallout New Vegas, mostly focused on telling a story of an individual who must overcome the trials of the wasteland to either change it for the better or the worse. They are story-driven games, mostly focusing on characters and interesting quests and scenarios and a little bit of exploration. They also have an underlying theme of corporations doing whatever they want to the American people under capitalism. Bethesda's Fallout games are different. Firstly, they don't understand the underlying theme and nuances of the original Fallout games. Secondly, they're mostly focused on exploration. While they do have interesting stories, they are nowhere near as in-depth and interesting as the originals or New Vegas, and Fallout 4 shows this perfectly. The game is mostly focused on exploration, combat, then scavenging for junk so you can build your settlements. The game is littered with interesting locations for you to discover that tell an interesting story. I covered this in my Fallout 4 video, in which I said that the best storytelling in Fallout 4 doesn't come from the main quest line. It's the pieces of paper or audio logs or random NPCs you find in these locations that let you piece a story together. And while I'm not happy with the way Bethesda streamlined conversations down in Fallout 4 to just 1 or 2 word answers, rather than the big blocks of dialogue you could read so you knew exactly what to say like a traditional RPG, I still understood where they were taking the series. I enjoyed Fallout 4, in fact it's one of my most played games and I have even 100%ed it, even all the DLC. There are other games out there for me that have a more traditional RPG experience, like The Outer Worlds that is basically a spiritual successor to Fallout New Vegas, my favourite Fallout game. But I knew whatever Fallout game Bethesda brought out next I would play because I enjoyed the gameplay. What I wasn't expecting was Bethesda to streamline the gameplay they had in Fallout 4, take out almost all aspects of an RPG, and double down on the locations, combat, and gathering gameplay. Because fundamentally, that's what Fallout 76 was at launch. It was a game that thrust you out into the wasteland of West Virginia and told you to follow these little checkpoints on your map, so you could find interesting locations, fight enemies, then loot everything that wasn't nailed down. There was no campaign, it was just audio logs that you could ignore if you wanted to. Now, this wouldn't have been a bad thing at launch, even though it seemed that Bethesda was now going away from the core message of the original games were. You still have a pretty solid foundation there, plus added multiplayer so people could play with your friends. What wasn't to love about it? The thing is, the game was rigged from the start. Kidding, the game was broken though, completely. It was bugs and glitches galore, from floating enemies, to weapons suddenly not being able to hit anything, to really bad lighting effects that shone through the ground like multiple spotlights turned on at once. That, plus the fact that the game often froze, then would crash, made the game almost unplayable. It felt like the game wasn't finished at all, and I still think that it wasn't. It didn't help that even outside the game in the real world, Bethesda was having a meltdown, from not giving players refunds to the great canvas bag incident in which people had bought the special edition of the game, got a lower quality bag than what they paid for, and don't even get me started on the Nuka Dark Rum incident. It seemed that every part of Fallout 76 was tainted. No one wanted to touch the game except for the most dedicated of fans. Bethesda was in crisis mode, and it hasn't been until Wastelanders was released a few weeks ago that the game is sort of getting back on its feet. But here's the thing, I don't think that Fallout 76 is going to be savable. Here's what I mean by that. We have seen plenty of games over the years be released and have a negative response by mostly everyone. They make a big comeback later on with massive improvements for the core game. Games like Destiny, No Man's Sky, and even Final Fantasy XIV have all had rocky launches and been universally hated, then come back a year or so later with a much better game that everyone enjoys. I don't think Fallout 76 is going to go the same way as those games, because at its core, it is still broken. Final Fantasy XIV had the same problem, but Square Enix ended up making a whole new game from scratch, and literally destroy the old one so no one could play it anymore, and you can only play the new and improved A Realm Reborn. I don't think Bethesda is ever going to do something like that. They're not the sort of company to do that. Look at Fallout 4 and Skyrim. Both those games were notoriously buggy on launch and took modders not working at Bethesda to fix those games and make it better. But then Bethesda tried to make a profit off their hard work using the Creation Club. They're not interested in making the best game they possibly can. Instead, they prefer to slowly patch the game over time until it's at a respectable quality. And does Wastelanders bring Fallout 76 up to a respectable quality? So far, no. That isn't to say there isn't anything to do in Wastelanders. There's a whole new story and quest line to play through and a bunch of side content to spend hours upon hours playing. It's enjoyable, and the final mission and the quest is heaps of fun and rather difficult, but it's still tacked on content. Bethesda didn't want NPCs in the game at all, but after the backlash when 76 released, they realised that that was the thing that players wanted the most, a real Fallout experience. Wastelanders does give players that experience, but it's still too little too late. But my experience of playing through Wastelanders may be different from someone who is either starting the game again or is playing the game for the first time. I started the DLC content on level 45. I put a lot of hours into 76 before the new update, and I'm onto the endgame content at this point. I fired nukes and beaten the Scorchbeast Queen a few times, so I didn't have to go through the mandatory leveling up that new players have to. And I think that's why I had a more enjoyable experience than those players. I didn't have to grind. But then grinding in Fallout 76 isn't really hard to do at all. What I did find, however, was how short the main story was. It only took me a few hours to finish completely. The missions were enjoyable and the characters were surprisingly memorable. The main story has you looking for treasure somewhere in Appalachia. The Overseer, who you've been following around since first exiting Vault 76, tasks you with making contact with people returning to West Virginia after the events of the main game. These two groups are the Raiders and the Settlers, and you can choose to side with either of them. It's basically the same decision you make in Fallout 4, but doesn't really have a drastic change on the outcome of the main quest. The most surprising part was how abruptly the main quest ends. You get access to a new currency and are able to purchase new armor, weapons, and camp plans for you to craft. But other than that, it just ends. The real content is in the companion quests. I don't know who at Bethesda decided that these quests should be longer and more tedious than the main quest. They go on forever, and not in a good way. While the characters themselves are interesting, the missions they send you on are shallow and uninspired. They amount to go here, kill person, collect thing, then head back. And there are so many of these missions you need to do that they literally have a bar on the quest log that slowly fills up as you complete quests for them. Why did Bethesda do this? Why not just give us a few quests for these companions, then make more interesting ones we can stumble upon out in the wasteland? After finishing one companion's quest line, I didn't want to have to go through an entire second bunch of quests with no real payoff. It's just busy work and a waste of time. Now some people might say, but Sean, games like these are meant to be grindy. You're meant to spend heaps of time running around doing mindless quests to get better loot. And yeah, I get that, but Fallout 76 doesn't draw you in like Destiny 2 or Final Fantasy XIV, where the world and enemies and characters are interesting. I can spend hours in Destiny 2 grinding out the same public event to finish an exotic quest because I know I'm getting something good at the end of it. Fallout 76 doesn't have that. Most of the time the weapons you get after completing quests are awful compared to the weapons you currently have in your inventory. Speaking of inventory, the gameplay is centered around you going around and picking up junk to either craft new weapons or armor or new things for your camp, and that junk adds up. Every RPG has a weight system in which your character can only hold a certain amount of items until the weight starts negatively affecting them. Fallout 76 has this problem, but like Fallout 4, you can store this junk in a chest back at your camp. The thing is, unlike Fallout 4 where the containers were bottomless pits you could throw literally everything into, Fallout 76 has a limit of 180 items for your stash. And you can't spawn more to get more space. Any stash box you spawn has the same things in it, they're all connected. At first, this wasn't a problem. In the early game, any junk you're picking up, you immediately scrap it, and you're only using a few weapons because all the other good weapons are level gated. So you're not slogging around heaps of ammunition and weapons like you would the end game. But once you do get to the end game, everything starts piling up. You're suddenly taking down more legendary enemies who drop a legendary weapon, but then you realise that legendary weapons and armour can't be scrapped for parts, and you have barely any more room left in your inventory or your stash to put it, and you can't sell it to any vendors. Oh no, this is going to be a problem, isn't it? But don't worry, Bethesda thought about this. They knew that the stash box inventory was too small, so they added an extension to your stash box. For a price. Yep, for $15 a month you can have access to more inventory space, private worlds without any other players in it, and a bunch of specialty items included in your membership. This is what I mean by Bethesda doesn't understand the underlying meanings of Fallout. They use Vault Boy unironically when trying to get people to buy this shitty product. It's laughable and I absolutely hate it. The thing is, you don't need to buy Fallout first, you just need to be more manageable about your inventory and stash space. Firstly, you need to forget everything about the main gameplay loop that both Fallout 4 and 76 try to teach you. Stop picking up everything. Only pick up the junk you need to craft something. The good thing is, Fallout 76 has a tag to search button on everything. If it's something you need, a little magnifying glass will show up next to the item's name when you go to pick it up, so you know whether you need it or not. Secondly, get a backpack. You can do this by doing the Order of the Tadpole quest. This will boost the amount of items your character can carry around with them. The only problem with the backpack is that it doesn't work in power armor for some reason. So keep that in mind if you're going into a hazardous area and need to use the power armor, because if you're overcumbered, then you'll be in deep trouble. Thirdly, always bulk your scraps together. If you have heaps of cloth or steel or wood like I do, then you can bulk them all together at a tinkerer's workbench. This will also decrease the amount of space they take up in your stash. This video is coming off as awfully negative. I really enjoy playing Fallout 76, but when you write down all the problems with it in front of you, you begin to wonder why you liked it at all in the first place. Fallout 76 does a few things really well, but those are completely overshadowed by all the negative things I have talked about. I can't recommend Fallout 76 to anyone. Ever. Even if the game somehow pulls a No Man's Sky and brings it back from the dead, it's still rotten at its core, trying to get as much money out of the player as physically possible. Wastelanders is a good start trying to make Fallout 76 a good Fallout game, but it's an impossibly hopeless task that is doomed to fail. Thanks for watching.